Hello YouTube and welcome to my humble channel. Do you find that your internet is a little bit slower than you think it should be? Are you creeped out by ads that seem to be following you around the internet? I'm going to show you how you can set up a Pi-hole, a device that will take back your bandwidth and your privacy. Strap in and let's get started. So let's take a look at what you're going to need to get started. The first and most obvious is the single board computer that you are going to get to run the Pi-hole software. In my case, I've decided to make this video about an Orange Pi Zero half gig model because there's lots of videos out there talking about how you can do this on a Raspberry Pi, but I feel like some of these lesser known fruits, if we want to call them that, don't get as much attention on the internet, and I think this particular device at a cost of $11 US is amazingly powerful. It's got 4 cores, it has half gig of RAM, so it's plenty powerful to run Pi-hole. Second is the SD card that's going to actually house the operating system files and anything else you choose to store on there. In my case, I'm running this on a 32 gig card. You could go a little bit smaller if the only thing that you intend to do with this is just to run it as a Pi-hole. Just take note that the better the quality of the SD card, the faster it's going to boot up. So for this one, it's an A1 certified model. You could go with something a little bit cheaper, but just be aware that the cheaper the card, generally you get what you pay for. It could fail quite quickly. Next is going to be a power and a power supply to go with it. So the nice thing about the Pi Zeros is that they run on just a plain micro USB cable. It's recommended to run on a 2 amp power supply, but I think you probably could even get away with a smaller 1 amp supply. And you are going to need either an Ethernet cable or a USB to serial cable. The reason for this is because the Orange Pi Zero does not have a HDMI port, it doesn't have a VGA port, it has no way for you to connect to the device and see what's on its display. So you're going to need to make first contact, so to speak. One or the other. I will be doing this demo and showing you how you can make this work with an Ethernet cable, but USB to serial cable, if you're going to be playing with these kinds of devices, is definitely a good thing to have. So as for the software that you're going to need to install, the first thing you'll need is the actual operating system software itself. I will provide the links for this in the description, but for the Orange Pi Zero, you can go to the Armbian page, just the one that I find the most convenient to use, and grab the Debian-based image, which is Armbian Buster. I think you probably could get away with the Ubuntu one, but I just haven't used it personally. I prefer to go with the Debian ones because they tend to be a bit more bare bones and more server-oriented. So you can download that here. The other thing that you will need to have is some software to write the SD card with the operating system image that you've got. I think the most convenient and user-friendly software to do that is Balena Etcher, although there are other ways of doing that. And the third piece of software is obviously the Pi-hole itself, although as you'll see later in the demo, we're not going to actually download this now, but we will set it up automatically once we make the first connection to the device itself. So we've downloaded the Armbian image, and I'm using Balena here on a Linux system, but it should look very similar if you're using this on a Mac or on Windows. So all you need to do is you need to select the Flash from File option, and we find the image that we downloaded earlier. So here you can see I've got the Orange Pi Zero specific image, so depending on which device you're using, it will be a slightly different file name. You do need the specific image for your device in order to get this to work. So I just select that. I've plugged in my SD card into the little SD card adapter from the image that I showed you earlier. And now I'm going to just go and select that one. So you can see this is a 32 gig card. I'll select it and then click Flash. So if you've purchased a relatively good quality SD card, this won't take too long. If you have a cheaper one, it might take a little while, but typically this shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. Okay, so we're just getting through the validation stage here. So a good rule of thumb if you've got a half-decent SD card is that the writing should go at a bare minimum of 10-15 megabytes per second, and the validation stage is going to be something above 50 megs a second. If you're not seeing the SD card write at that speed, you might want to consider getting a little bit better SD card, because then the device will perform better, but it's not a strict requirement. In any case, now the SD card has been flashed and we are ready to install it into our device. So I've just finished the image burn as I showed you, and now I've got my SD card device here. I'm going to pull the little micro USB card, or micro SD card, that we're actually going to insert into the Orange Pi. So you want to take this and put it on the back here and plug that in, and it should make a nice little click sound. And the other thing you'll need as well is your micro USB power supply. So this one will plug in here. And the other thing that you probably will need, or I'll do for this demo, is a Ethernet cable, and you'll want to plug that in here. So once you have all this stuff, this cable here is going to go to your router, and this you'll need to plug into your USB power supply. So I've just plugged in the Orange Pi to power, and I've connected the Ethernet cable to the back of my modem, and I gave it about a minute. It might take 30 seconds, 2 minutes, depending on how quick the SD card is that you're using. And this is where things get a little bit fun, because as I mentioned before, the Orange Pi devices like the Zero are meant to be very minimalistic, and they don't have anything like an HDMI port that you can use to connect to a display and connect a keyboard to it to do stuff. So you need to figure out how to connect to it the very first time before you set everything up to work automatically. So what that really means is that you need to figure out what IP address it grabbed automatically when you plugged it into the router. So this will be different for every person depending on the router that you're using, whether you're using it from your internet provider, or whether you have your own or whatever. So I hope you'll be able to figure that out. Generally, if you're able to figure out what your IP address is, in my case, I've got 168.2.15 here. The router is on .2.1. And then within the router, I was able to find a device which is called Orange Pi 0. And here I can see that it got this IP address 192.168.2.19. If you don't want to use, or you don't want to bother with this approach, you also have the option of using something like Nmap. Although I think if you are capable of using Nmap, I would assume that you're probably good enough to figure out having the IP address in the first place. But just in case you want to use that, you can scan your whole subnet, and usually the Orange Pi will show up as something like this, unknown, and it should only be exposing the SSH service. So assuming that you were able to figure out how to, or what the IP address is of the device that you just plugged in, the next step is going to be to actually connect to it. Okay, so now we know the IP address of the device that we just plugged into our network, and we are ready to actually connect to it. So since I'm using Linux, I'm going to be using SSH, but if you're on Windows, you may want to use PuTTY or whatever your favorite terminal program is. So the wonderfully secure default password for Armbian-based installations is 1234. So we're going to connect like that. And the first time you log in, you have to set a new password and go through all this stuff. So I'll just go through this quickly. And some of this might take a minute or two, as it does a bunch of writes to the device as it's setting everything up. So I'm actually going to fast forward this in YouTube time, but don't worry if this takes a little bit longer. So we are just going to create a personal user, and the rest of the information you don't really need to fill out. So now I've got a personal user account and the root account set up on the device, and it's no longer using the default 1234 password, which is good. And we are actually now ready to install Pi-hole. So let's log out from the root access and now use our newly created account. So now we want to set up Pi-hole. So as I mentioned earlier, we weren't going to download it ahead of time. We're going to set it up as on the device in kind of real time. And they give you a nice link here to install Pi-hole. And this will take us to the GitHub page. And it provides you some nice kind of methods to do automated installs. For a Raspbian, a Raspberry Pi-based device, you could use this command, but for reasons that you will see in a moment, we will go with this option. I mean, basically it's the same thing. We're going to just download this install script to the local file system, and then we're going to run it manually, as opposed to piping it in directly. So let's do that now. So we've got our basic install scripts ready to go, and we have to set. So what's going to happen is it's going to start the installation procedure, which is very, very nicely done. And while this is working, it's going to eventually figure out that we are on a Orange Pi device, and it's going to complain. So this is the first problem that you'll hit, and this looks a little bit scary, but in reality this is just a kind of a sensible approach from the Pi-hole team, is that they don't want to have to support every possible device that this can be run on. But in my experience, I've been running this on a Orange Pi Zero myself for now almost a month, and it's been almost completely flawless. The only time there was a problem was when I accidentally kicked the device as I was cleaning, but that one I don't think you can fault the Pi-hole or the Orange Pi for. So all we're going to have to do is run this script in the same way. So we will do Pi-hole skip os check equals true sudo -e to make sure that this gets passed to basic install. And we're going to just do the same thing again, but it should take a little bit less time because now it's already got all of this stuff updated. And we're now into the text-based installation. So we're just going to click OK on a bunch of these different things. So this is an important thing here to note, that you will want this device to have a static IP address. I'll go into that a little bit later, but for the moment you can probably assume that it will continue to get the same IP address from your router just based on the MAC address. So for now we will use eth0. So this is an important thing to note. So in this case we're going to be running the Pi-hole on the Ethernet device, which will require us to keep it connected to the router with the Ethernet cable. If you want something that's a little bit more discreet or a little bit more with less cabling and that kind of stuff around, we can configure the Wi-Fi interface, although I would recommend against it just for the reason that the Ethernet device will be a little bit faster, especially on these Pi Zeros. I've noticed that the Wi-Fi is a little bit less responsive. The latency is not quite as good. So we'll just continue with the Ethernet-based installation, although you can do this later. And then this upstream DNS provider, you can select any of them. I'll just go with OpenDNS. And then these are the third-party lists that you want to subscribe to for ad blocking. I would just go with the defaults. And again, you can select the defaults for protocols. And this is the configuration for our network here that we're going to configure. And here again, it will give you another warning about how bad thing this will be for you if another device tries to take this IP address. So it's very, very important that the Orange Pi that you're configuring always be given the same IP. And the web and main interface, I would recommend installing unless you're trying to install this on a very, very, very minimalistic, very lightweight device with only 256 megs of RAM, but since ours is a half gig, this is definitely a nice thing to have. And the web server, yeah, I would just go with OK. Logging queries is interesting, at least at the beginning, when you want to see what's being filtered. But eventually, as more people, when you have guests visit your home, it could be thought of as a little bit unethical to be recording everything that they're doing, because they may not assume that you have access to this. So eventually you might want to turn this off, but for the moment we'll keep it on just so that we can show how prolific the Pi-hole is in filtering. And you can also specify the level of detail that it will preserve for its logging. So it will continue to install software. This is mostly for the web interface here, for all this PHP stuff. So we're just getting into the home stretch here. So we are ready and we have installed. So with your default installation, you will be told where the admin interface is and also the admin password. Of course, I'm going to have to go and change that now that this is going out to the internets, but this is what you will see when you install it yourself. So I'm going to just copy that down. And we are ready to go. So Pi-hole is now running on our network. So at this point we have Pi-hole actually running on the device, and it is ready to start accepting requests and filtering out the stuff that we don't want coming in. So to give you just a very quick demo of how well this actually does work, before we do this in a kind of permanent way via the router configuration, I will just temporarily quickly show you how effective this is. So I'm going to just go on my Linux device where it's fairly easy to set up the DNS server and just set the DNS to the actual Pi-hole address. And now, as an example of a site that I frequently visit is Worldometers, where I'm always, a little bit addicted to the coronavirus information. So this was the site just a few seconds ago. So you can see all of this visual noise, let's put it that way. I've actually disabled the browser-based one that I was using before, and I'm going to refresh it. And now you can see everything is gone except for the stuff that we actually want to read. So this is what the Pi-hole is doing for you. And if we actually go into the dashboard, you can already see it providing details about how many queries it allowed through, how many it blocked, and the percentage, and how many domains are on the block list. So this is pretty significant. So 35% or almost 36% of the requests that I've just sent out in the time that the Pi-hole has been my DNS server, which is not very long, were actually blocked. Okay, so we're on to the final step now, which is to actually configure our router to use the Pi-hole as its primary DNS server. So what this is doing is basically saying anything that connects to my network, use the Pi-hole as the sort of first stop to check what the DNS or what the IP address of any given domain might be. So what this means in practice is, let's say you try to access google.com. The Pi-hole will look at google.com and it'll say, okay, this domain looks okay, and it will pass it through to the real DNS servers. But if you try to connect to spytracker.net or something like that, and it is on the list of domains that are considered to be undesirable, the Pi-hole will just sort of route this to nothing. And whatever web page or whatever it is that you were doing that was trying to retrieve data from there will not receive any response. And so that's why in the coronavirus page that I just showed you, that was why all the ads just disappeared, because it loaded all of the stuff that you're interested in seeing, and the ads were just removed. But it's not just the visible ads, it's also all of the tracking and a lot of other stuff that's going on behind the scenes that's also getting filtered as well. So we are going to do this final critical step. So now this will be very different depending on your router configuration, so I'll just show you one example of how this works here. For anyone that might notice, I actually, in the meantime, for this stage, I actually had to reconfigure the Pi and set it up with a static IP beforehand, because depending on your router, you may or may not be able to use one of the DHCP addresses that you got. So I got .19 initially. You might not be able to make sure that that's the static IP. So just be aware of that depending on how your router is set up. So if you're able to get into the advanced tools and settings, or whatever the equivalent is on your router, you will want to go to the DNS portion, and we click here. So here you can see usually you'll have something that says what is the default. In our case, we want to not use these ones, so these are going to be the ones that we will defer to only if we're okay with the domain not being on that list. So we're going to set it manual. So here, now we click change. Oh, what the hell is this? So we have got our DNS settings configured. I have got my laptop here and a couple other devices set up to use the Pi-hole as its DNS server and not the default one. And you can see that even just this relatively short period of time that I've been using it, it has been doing quite a lot of filtering, and there's a lot of interesting results that the dashboard will give you. So you can see here, for example, it will show you all of the top permitted domains, and you'll see all the stuff that it's blocked. So many of these things are tracking related, as you can see, and it gives you some nice statistics about how many IP addresses on your network have been connected and using the DNS server. You've also got this, which I would recommend to disable, once you've got this up and running, and if people are going to be connecting to your network that you might not be aware of the fact that you're tracking everything they're doing. Here you can see all the stuff that they're connecting to and what's being allowed and what isn't being allowed. And this stuff is also available in a more long-term form. And there's also nice statistics that the Pi-hole dashboard gives you. It's not a bad idea to check in once in a while to make sure that the temperature is staying low. You want to make sure this is well below 50. Memory usage and load, you can see that the Orange Pi Zero, even though it's a $11 device, is more than capable of handling the load involved in being a DNS server doing this. So yeah, at this point we're good to go. Well, I hope you found all of this informative. I will leave links to all of the relevant sites in the description below. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to leave me a comment. Thanks again for watching, and so long.